5 children screamed like a storm tearing through a mansion that no nanny could survive. 99 had tried and fled, plates shattered, doors slammed. Fear lived in every corner of Musa Danjuma's house. Then one night, a quiet maid named Zuwaira Abdullahi stepped into the chaos and did the unthinkable. She didn't shout, she didn't run, she sang, and somehow, the screaming stopped. One by one, the children fell silent, then asleep in her arms. Outside the door, their powerful father stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. Who was this woman? And why could she reach the hearts no one else could? Before we continue, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. In the heart of Abuja, where glass towers reflected the burning gold of the Nigerian sun, stood the empire of Musa Danjuma, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms, government offices, and whispered conversations among the elite. He was known as a visionary, a strategist, a man who could turn dust into wealth. But behind the gates of his sprawling mansion in Maitama Musa Danjuma was something else entirely. He was a father drowning in silence. The mansion itself was magnificent marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, towering windows draped in silk chandeliers that shimmered like captured stars. From the outside, it looked like a place where happiness lived. But inside, something had long been broken. Ever since the death of his wife, Amina Danjuma, the house had lost its soul. Amina had been the warmth in Musa's cold world. She was laughter in the mornings, soft songs in the evenings, and the gentle voice that held their children together. When she passed away suddenly, after a brief illness, it felt as though the foundation of the family had collapsed overnight. And the children, they did not just grieve. They changed. Sadiq, the eldest, at 13, became distant and sharp-tongued, his grief turning into anger he did not know how to control. Jamila, once full of light, stopped smiling altogether, retreating into a quiet world of silence. Farouk and Layla, the twins, grew wild, fighting, shouting, breaking anything within reach. And little Hassan, barely 4 years old, cried through nights that never seemed to end. At first, Musa tried to fix it the way he fixed everything else in life with money. He hired the best child psychologists. He brought in tutors, therapists, and caregivers from across the country. When that failed, he went further international experts, luxury schools, specialized programs. But nothing worked. The children did not listen. They did not cooperate. They did not heal. And so began the revolving door of nannies. The first nanny arrived with confidence, dressed in crisp uniforms and carrying years of experience. She lasted 3 days. She left quietly, her eyes hollow, refusing to speak about what had happened. The second lasted a week. She walked out shouting, her voice shaking as she demanded to be paid immediately. The third didn't even make it through her first night. By the time the 10th nanny left, the staff had begun to whisper. By the 20th, the mansion had developed a reputation. By the 50th, no one came without hesitation. And by the 99th, no one wanted the job anymore. The house staff had seen everything. They had watched as plates were thrown across rooms, as expensive vases shattered against walls, as doors were locked from the inside, while children screamed and cried for a mother who would never return. They had seen nannies pushed to tears, insulted, ignored, and driven to the edge of breakdown. "This is not normal," one of the older housemaids had whispered one evening in the staff quarters. "These children, they are hurting too much." But no one dared say that to Musa Danjuma, because Musa himself was not the same man anymore. He rarely smiled. His face had hardened into something unreadable, something distant. He spent longer hours at work, returning late into the night, often after the children had already cried themselves to sleep. And when he was home, he kept his distance, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to reach them. There were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when he would stand outside their rooms, his hand hovering near the door, listening to the echoes of their pain. And in those moments, something inside him would break. But he never went in. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to replace a mother. So instead he built walls. And behind those walls his children slowly unraveled. One afternoon the tension reached its peak. A new nanny number 99 had arrived just 2 days earlier. Her name was Grace Okiki, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor and a hopeful smile. She had assured Musa that she had handled difficult children before. "I understand grief," she had said gently. "I will be patient with them." Musa had nodded, though something in his eyes suggested he had heard those same words too many times. That afternoon the house was unusually quiet. Too quiet, Grace moved carefully down the hallway, her steps cautious as she approached the children's playroom. The door was slightly open. Inside, the room looked peaceful at first glance. Sunlight streaming through the windows, toys scattered neatly across the floor. Then she stepped in, and everything changed. A bucket of water came crashing down from above the door, drenching her from head to toe. Before she could react, loud laughter erupted from behind the furniture. "Look at her!" Farouk shouted. "She looks like a drowned chicken," Layla added, clapping her hands. Grace gasped, stunned water dripping from her hair and clothes. Her heart pounded as she tried to regain control of the situation. "That is not funny," she said, her voice trembling. "You must not." A pillow hit her face. Then another. Within seconds, chaos exploded. The twins charged around the room, throwing toys, knocking over chairs. Jamila stood in the corner, watching silently, her eyes empty. Sadiq leaned against the wall, arms crossed, observing everything with cold detachment. And little Hassan. He began to cry. Loud, uncontrollable sobs that cut through the noise like a knife. Grace tried to move toward him, but a chair was pushed into her path. "Don't touch him!" Sadiq snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. Grace froze. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, suffocating, overwhelming. This was not just misbehavior. This was something deeper, something broken, something she was not prepared to fix. Her composure shattered. I cannot do this," she whispered, stepping back. The children didn't stop her. They didn't apologize. They didn't care. Grace turned and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the front gate. Her clothes still soaked her dignity left behind in the playroom. That evening she stood before Musa in the grand living room, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely steady. "I thought I could help them, but they don't want help. They are not just difficult, they are in pain. And I am not strong enough." Musa said nothing. He simply nodded. He had heard it all before. Grace left without looking back. And just like that, she became the 99th. The mansion fell into silence again, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after something breaks. Upstairs, the children returned to their rooms. Sadiq sat alone, staring at the wall. Jamila curled up in her bed, her eyes open, but distant. The twins argued until their voices faded into exhaustion. And Hassan cried himself to sleep. Downstairs, Musa stood alone in the dim light of the living room. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he walked to the large window overlooking the city. Abuja stretched out before him, alive, thriving, full of people chasing dreams and building lives. But inside his home, everything was falling apart. He closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Not about his business, not about his wealth, but about something far more important. "What if I've already lost them?" he murmured under his breath. The question lingered in the air unanswered, because somewhere beyond the gates of that mansion, a young woman named Zuwaira Abdullahi was about to walk into their lives. and nothing would ever be the same again. In a quiet district on the outskirts of Kano, life moved slowly, shaped by necessity rather than choice. The streets were narrow and dusty, lined with small houses that carried the marks of time and survival. Children ran barefoot between doorways, their laughter rising above the hum of daily struggle. It was not a place of luxury, but it was a place where people held on, even when life gave them very little. This was where Zuwaira Abdullahi lived. Her home was small, just a single room with cracked walls and a corrugated roof that rattled whenever the wind grew strong. Inside, there was only what was necessary: a thin mattress, a wooden stool, a cooking pot, and a small shelf where a few belongings were carefully arranged. Yet, despite its simplicity, the room felt lived in. It carried warmth, care, and quiet resilience. Zuwaira stood near the doorway, stirring a pot over a small kerosene stove. The evening light fell gently across her face, revealing a calm expression shaped by years of responsibility. She moved with quiet efficiency, every action measured, every movement purposeful. Behind her, her younger brother Yusuf, just 10 years old, sat cross-legged on the floor with his school books spread out in front of him. "Yusuf," she said softly, not turning around. "Have you finished your assignment?" There was a pause. "I'm trying," he replied. Zuwaira smiled faintly. She could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Bring it here." He walked over slowly, holding out his notebook. She wiped her hands quickly and took it, scanning the page with careful attention. "You rushed this part," she said gently, pointing at a line. "You understand it. You just need to take your time." Yusuf nodded, watching her closely. To him, Zuwaira was more than a sister. She was the one who made sure there was food, the one who stayed up when he was sick, the one who never gave up even when everything else seemed uncertain. Their mother had died years ago after a long illness. Their father had disappeared even earlier, leaving behind nothing but silence. From that moment on, Zuwaira had stepped into a role she never chose but never refused. She became everything Yusuf needed. Before life changed, Zuwaira had worked as a nursery school teacher. She had loved it, the children, the laughter, the simple joy of helping young minds grow. But when her mother fell ill, she left her job without hesitation. Family came first. Since then, survival had been her only steady occupation. She washed clothes for neighbors, cooked food to sell by the roadside, and took on any small job she could find. It was never stable, never enough, but she managed. Because she had to. That evening, after Yusuf returned to his books, Zuwaira stepped outside for a moment of air. The sky stretched wide above Kano, painted in soft shades of orange and fading blue. For a brief second, she allowed herself to pause. Just breathe. But life rarely gave her long moments of rest. A neighbor approached, holding a folded newspaper. "Zuwaira," the woman called. "I saw something you should look at." Zuwaira took the paper, her eyes scanning the page the woman pointed to. It was a job advertisement. Live-in nanny needed. Abuja. High salary. Immediate start. Below it, a name stood out clearly. Musa Danjuma. Zuwaira's expression shifted slightly. She knew the name. Almost everyone did. A powerful man. A wealthy man. A man whose life was far removed from hers. But it was not the name that held her attention. It was the description. Must be patient. Emotionally strong. Able to handle difficult children. The neighbor lowered her voice. "They say no one lasts in that house," she said quietly. "People leave quickly. And they don't talk about what happened inside." Zuwaira looked at the words again. Difficult children. Emotionally strong. High salary. Her thoughts drifted back to the room behind her. To Yusuf. To the quiet struggles they faced every day, the unpaid school fees, the meals that were sometimes too small, the future that felt uncertain. This job could change that. or it could break her. "I will think about it," she said softly. That night sleep did not come easily. Zuwaira lay awake beside Yusuf, staring at the ceiling as shadows moved across the walls. Her mind returned again and again to the advertisement. Abuja was far. The job was risky. The stories were unsettling. And yet, the opportunity was real. She turned slightly, looking at Yusuf as he slept peacefully. His face free from worry in that moment reminded her why she endured everything. For him. Always for him. By morning, her decision was made. She packed a small bag, only what she needed. A few clothes, a scarf, the little money she had saved. Yusuf stood by the door watching her. "You're really going?" he asked quietly. Zuwaira knelt in front of him, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "Yes," she said. "I have to try." He looked down. "What if they are too difficult?" She smiled, though her eyes carried something deeper. "Then I will do my best," she replied. "And if it doesn't work, I will come back." Yusuf nodded slowly, then stepped forward and hugged her tightly. "Come back soon," he whispered. Zuwaira held him for a moment longer than usual. "I will," she said. A neighbor agreed to look after Yusuf while she was gone. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough. And so with quiet determination, Zuwaira left Kano. The journey to Abuja felt like crossing into another world. The familiar sights of Kano slowly disappeared, replaced by wider roads, taller buildings, and a faster pace of life. By the time she arrived, the difference was clear. Abuja felt distant, structured, unfamiliar. She adjusted her scarf as she stood before the gates of Musa Danjuma's mansion. They were tall, imposing, guarded by uniformed security. For a moment she hesitated. This place did not feel like it belonged to her. Everything about it reminded her of the distance between her world and his. She could turn back. No one would know. No one would blame her. But then she thought of Yusuf again, and she stepped forward. "I'm here for the nanny position," she said. The guard studied her briefly before making a call. A few moments later, the gates opened slowly. Zuwaira walked inside. The mansion was as grand as she had imagined, polished floors, wide halls, silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Everything was perfect on the surface. But beneath it, something felt wrong. She followed a staff member down a long hallway. Then suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by shouting. Another crash. Zuwaira stopped. Her heart tightened. The staff member didn't react. "They've started," he said calmly. She looked at him. "They always do." For a brief moment, fear rose sharply inside her. This was real. The chaos. The reason 99 others had left. She could still walk away. Nothing was forcing her to stay. But instead, Zuwaira took a slow breath and continued forward. Because deep inside her, beyond fear and doubt, was something stronger. Not confidence, not certainty, but quiet courage. The kind that grows from hardship. The kind that does not disappear when things become difficult. And as she stepped closer to the noise, she did not yet know it. But she was walking into a storm that would test her in ways she had never imagined, and somehow, she would become the calm inside it. The first sound Zuwaira clearly recognized inside Musa Danjuma's mansion was not the crash of breaking objects. It was laughter, not joyful laughter, but sharp, chaotic laughter, wild and uncontained, echoing through the hallway like something that had lost its innocence long ago. She followed the sound upstairs, her steps steady even as her heart beat faster. The staff member who had guided her earlier had already disappeared, leaving her alone to face what everyone else seemed to avoid. At the end of the corridor, a door stood half open. Another loud bang came from inside. Zuwaira paused for a brief second. Then she gently pushed the door open. The scene inside was nothing like anything she had experienced before. The playroom was in chaos. Toys were scattered across the floor. A chair lay on its side. One of the shelves had been partially emptied books thrown carelessly across the room. A broken picture frame rested near the wall, glass pieces glinting faintly in the light. And in the middle of it all, 5 children. Farouk and Layla, the twins, were running in circles, shouting loudly, their movements fast and unpredictable. Hassan stood near the corner, crying uncontrollably, his small body shaking. Jamila sat by the window, silent, hugging her knees tightly, her gaze distant and empty. And Sadiq. He stood apart from the others, leaning against the wall, watching everything with cold, calculated stillness. For a moment, no one noticed Zuwaira. Then Farouk turned. "Another one," he shouted. The room shifted instantly. All eyes moved toward her. Zuwaira did not step back. She stood quietly, taking in the scene, not reacting, not rushing forward, not raising her voice, just observing. Layla tilted her head, studying her. "She doesn't look scared," she said. Sadiq's eyes narrowed slightly. "They all look like that," at first he replied calmly. Zuwaira walked a few steps into the room. "I'm Zuwaira," she said gently. No response. Farouk picked up a toy car and threw it in her direction. It hit the floor near her feet with a loud clatter. "Go away," he said. She didn't move. "I'm here to take care of you." She continued, her tone calm, steady. Layla laughed. "We don't need you." Another object flew across the room, this time a pillow. It brushed past her shoulder. Still, Zuwaira did not react. Her eyes shifted slowly from one child to another. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something else. Understanding. She noticed the tightness in Jamila's posture. The way Hassan's cries came in uneven bursts. The restless energy in the twins, as if they didn't know where to place their emotions. And Sadiq, the way he watched everything guarded, distant, carrying something heavier than the others. This was not just bad behavior. This was pain. Deep, unresolved pain. Zuwaira took another step forward. That was when it began. Farouk grabbed a small plastic bucket filled with water from the corner and flung it toward her. Cold water splashed across her clothes. A collective burst of laughter followed. "She's wet," Layla shouted. Hassan's crying grew louder, feeding off the rising chaos. Zuwaira blinked once, water dripping slowly from her scarf. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She didn't scold them. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she reached for a nearby cloth, calmly drying her hands before setting it aside. The children hesitated. Just for a second. They were used to reactions. Fear, anger, shouting. But this was different. Sadiq stepped forward slightly. "Why are you still standing there?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You should leave." Zuwaira met his gaze. "I haven't finished my work yet," she replied quietly. His expression hardened. "You don't have any work here." There was a pause. Then, in a low voice, he added, "No one stays." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything else in the room. Zuwaira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her attention to Hassan, who was now crying harder, his small hands covering his face. Slowly, carefully, she moved toward him. "Don't touch him," Sadiq snapped. Zuwaira stopped. She didn't step back, but she didn't move forward either. She lowered herself to Hassan's level, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly. Hassan didn't respond. His crying continued, uneven and strained. Zuwaira didn't try to silence him. She simply stayed there. Present. Patient. Time passed. A minute. 2. The chaos in the room began to shift. Farouk and Layla slowed their movements, their energy losing direction without the usual reactions to fuel it. Jamila glanced over briefly, her expression unreadable. Sadiq watched closely. Zuwaira spoke again, her voice gentle. "It's okay to cry." Hassan's sobs didn't stop, but they softened slightly. She didn't reach out. She didn't force comfort. She allowed him space. And that was new. Eventually, Hassan lowered his hands just enough to look at her. Their eyes met. For the first time since she entered the room, the noise seemed to fade. Zuwaira offered a small, reassuring smile. Nothing more. No pressure. No demand. Just presence. Hassan's crying quieted, not completely, but enough to change the atmosphere. The room felt different now. Less explosive. More uncertain. Zuwaira slowly stood. "I will be here," she said, looking at all of them. "You don't have to accept me today." She paused. "But I'm not leaving." Farouk frowned. Layla crossed her arms. Jamila looked away again. And Sadiq? He said nothing. But something in his expression shifted just slightly. Not trust, not acceptance, but recognition. This one was not like the others. Later that evening, Zuwaira was shown to a small room near the children's wing. It was simple, clean, and quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed, her clothes now dry, her body tired, but her mind still alert. The day replayed in her thoughts. The chaos, the anger, the pain behind it. She understood it more than they knew, because she had felt something similar once. Loss. Fear. The emptiness left behind when someone important disappears. But she also knew something else. Healing does not happen in one day. It does not come from force. It comes from patience, from consistency, from staying, even when it is hard. Down the hallway, the house slowly settled into silence. Not peaceful silence, but something quieter than before. And in a dimly lit office downstairs, Musa Danjuma sat alone watching the security footage. He had seen everything. The water, the defiance, the tension, and the moment when somehow the chaos had slowed. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "She didn't react," he murmured. That alone was unusual. But what unsettled him more was what came after. She stayed. For the first time in a long while, Musa did not turn off the screen immediately. He kept watching. Because something about Zuwaira Abdullahi did not fit the pattern. And somewhere deep inside, beneath years of distance and control, a question began to form. What if she doesn't leave? Upstairs, unaware of the eyes that had been watching her, Zuwaira lay down slowly. Her body was tired, but her resolve was not. Tomorrow would be harder. She knew that. But she also knew something else. She had seen the truth behind the chaos. And now that she had seen it, she would not walk away. Morning came quietly, but peace did not follow. The first sound that broke the silence in Musa Danjuma's mansion was a sharp crash from the dining hall, ceramic shattering against marble. Then came shouting. Not loud enough to wake the entire house, but intense enough to signal one thing clearly. The storm had not passed. Zuwaira was already awake. She had barely slept, her body still adjusting to a new place, her mind replaying every moment from the previous day. But when she heard the noise, she did not hesitate. She stood, adjusted her scarf, and stepped into the hallway. Downstairs, the dining area was already in chaos. Breakfast had been prepared, carefully arranged plates, fresh breadfruit, warm tea. But now it looked like a battlefield. One plate lay shattered on the floor. A chair had been pushed aside. Tea had spilled across the table, dripping slowly onto the polished surface. Farouk stood on one of the chairs, grinning like he had just won a game. Layla was laughing, clapping her hands in delight. Jamila sat at the far end, untouched food in front of her, her expression distant. Little Hassan stood near the table, his eyes filled with confusion more than anger. And Sadiq. He sat at the head of the table, calm, silent, watching everything unfold, like a director observing a scene he had already planned. Zuwaira stepped into the room. No one greeted her. No one acknowledged her presence. She walked toward the broken plate and knelt down slowly. Without a word, she began to pick up the pieces. Farouk noticed first. "She's cleaning," he said, amused. Layla leaned forward. "We should make more mess." Farouk didn't need encouragement. He grabbed a cup and pushed it off the table. It shattered beside Zuwaira's hand. She paused for a brief second, then continued. No reaction, no anger, just quiet movement. Sadiq watched closely, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was waiting for the moment she would break, because they all did. Every single one of them. Eventually. "You're wasting your time," he said coldly. Zuwaira didn't look up. Maybe she replied calmly. That answer wasn't what he expected. He leaned forward slightly. "Why are you still here?" he asked. "You saw yesterday. You know how this ends." Zuwaira finished gathering the broken pieces and placed them carefully on a tray before standing. Then she looked at him. "Because you are still here," she said. The room went still. For a brief second, even the twins stopped moving. Sadiq's expression hardened. "That doesn't mean anything." Zuwaira shook her head slightly. "It means everything." He didn't respond. Instead, he pushed his chair back abruptly and stood up. "I'm not interested in your words," he said sharply. Then he walked out of the room. The tension he left behind lingered like a shadow. Farouk and Layla looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Without Sadiq leading the chaos, their energy felt scattered. Zuwaira turned her attention to Hassan. "Have you eaten?" she asked gently. He shook his head. She moved closer, keeping her movements slow, careful not to startle him. "You can try," she said softly, placing a small piece of bread near him. He hesitated, then slowly reached for it. It was a small action, but it mattered. Across the table, Jamila watched silently. Zuwaira noticed, but did not call attention to it. She returned to cleaning, restoring the table piece by piece, not rushing, not forcing anything, just creating space. Later that morning, the house staff whispered among themselves. "She's still here?" one of them asked in disbelief. "Yes," another replied, and she didn't even shout. They exchanged looks. This was new, too new. Upstairs, Sadiq sat alone in his room staring out the window. Zuwaira's words replayed in his mind. "Because you are still here." He didn't like it. He didn't like the way it sounded, the way it felt. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Something he didn't understand. He pushed the thought away. He didn't need her. None of them did. That afternoon, Zuwaira tried something different. Instead of approaching the children directly, she began organizing the playroom. Quietly, carefully. She picked up the scattered toys, arranged them neatly wiped down surfaces, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. The room slowly changed. Not dramatically, but enough to feel different. When Farouk and Layla entered, they stopped. "What happened here?" Layla asked. Zuwaira looked up from where she was folding a small blanket. "I cleaned," she said simply. Farouk frowned. Why? Zuwaira shrugged lightly. "Because it's your space." They exchanged confused looks. No one had ever said that to them before. Your space. Not a place to destroy, not a place to escape, but something that belonged to them. They didn't respond, but they didn't start breaking things either. That alone was a shift. In the evening, Musa returned home earlier than usual. He didn't go to his office immediately. Instead, he paused near the hallway, listening. There was noise, but it wasn't the same. Less shouting, less chaos, more movement, controlled. He frowned slightly, then walked toward the monitoring room, the screens lit up in front of him showing different parts of the house. His eyes settled on the playroom. Zuwaira was there, sitting on the floor, not speaking, not directing, just present. Nearby, Hassan played quietly with a toy. Farouk and Layla sat a short distance away, not interacting with her, but not disrupting anything either. And Jamila, she was watching, not distant, not completely closed off, but observing. Musa leaned closer to the screen. This was different, not fixed, not perfect, but different. He sat back slowly. For the first time in a long time, something unfamiliar stirred within him. Not control, not frustration, but curiosity. Upstairs, Sadiq stood at the doorway of the playroom, watching from a distance. He had been there for several minutes. No one had noticed. His eyes moved from one sibling to another, and then to Zuwaira. She wasn't forcing them. She wasn't trying to replace anything. She was just there. That unsettled him more than anything else. Finally, he stepped forward. The room shifted slightly as his presence was felt. Farouk and Layla looked up immediately. Hassan paused. Jamila's gaze flickered toward him. Zuwaira remained still. Sadiq walked into the room slowly, then stopped a few steps away from her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, he said, "You won't last." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was certain. Zuwaira looked up at him. Their eyes met. And instead of arguing, instead of defending herself, she simply said, "Maybe." That answer caught him off guard. "But I'm still here today," she added gently. Silence followed, heavy, unresolved. Sadiq stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. But this time, he didn't slam the door. He didn't start chaos. He just left. Zuwaira watched him go, her expression calm but thoughtful. Because she understood something important. The battle was not in the shouting, not in the broken plates, not in the chaos. The real battle was inside them, and slowly, very slowly, something was beginning to shift. Downstairs, Musa turned off the screen. His mind was no longer focused on business. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about something else. About someone else. Zuwaira Abdullahi. The girl who didn't shout. The girl who didn't leave. The girl who said maybe, and stayed anyway. He exhaled slowly. Something was changing in his house. He could feel it, but he didn't yet know how deep that change would go. The night the house broke again was the night everything began to change. It started quietly, too quietly. By late evening, the mansion had settled into an uneasy stillness. Dinner had passed with less resistance than usual. The twins had argued, but stopped short of throwing anything. Jamila had eaten a few bites. Hassan had stayed close to Zuwaira without clinging. Even Sadiq had remained at the table longer than expected, silent but present. To anyone else, it might have looked like progress. To Zuwaira, it felt like a storm waiting. Children who carried deep pain did not change in a straight line. They rose and fell, pushed forward and pulled back. And sometimes when things felt calm on the surface, that was when everything underneath erupted. She sensed it in the way Hassan kept glancing toward the hallway, in how Jamila's fingers tightened around her spoon, in the restless energy building inside the twins, in the tension in Sadiq's shoulders, though he said nothing. Something was coming. And then it happened. A scream tore through the silence, not loud at first, but sharp, raw. "Hassan!" Zuwaira stood immediately. Good. Before she could reach him, another sound followed Farouk shouting, Layla crying, something crashing against the wall. Within seconds, the house erupted. Zuwaira ran toward the children's rooms. The hallway lights flickered as doors slammed open and shut. Shadows moved quickly. The calm from earlier had shattered completely. When she reached Hassan's room, the scene was overwhelming. Hassan was on the floor, crying uncontrollably, his small body shaking violently. His breathing was uneven, panicked. His eyes were wide, unfocused. Farouk and Layla were yelling over each other, pushing and blaming. Jamila stood frozen near the wall, her hands pressed tightly against her ears. And Sadiq. He stood in the center of the room, his voice raised, trying to control the chaos, but only feeding it. "Stop it," he shouted. "All of you stop." But no one listened, because this was not disobedience. This was fear. Deep, buried fear breaking through all at once. Zuwaira didn't shout. She didn't demand silence. She moved straight to Hassan, slowly, carefully. She knelt beside him, lowering herself to his level. "Hassan," she said softly. No response. His crying only grew louder. She didn't try to stop it. Instead, she gently placed one hand near him, not touching just close enough for him to feel her presence. "I'm here," she whispered. Around them, the chaos continued. Farouk shoved Layla. She screamed back. Jamila's breathing grew faster, her body trembling. Sadiq tried again to intervene, his frustration rising. "Enough," he yelled. But it only made things worse. Zuwaira understood something in that moment. This was not 5 separate storms. It was one shared pain, one memory, one absence that still lived inside all of them. She looked up. "Come here," she said gently. No one moved. Her voice didn't change. "Come here," she repeated, softer this time. There was something different in the way she said it. Not a command, an invitation. Jamila was the first to move. Slowly, uncertainly, she stepped closer. Then Layla. Then Farouk, though he tried to hide his hesitation. Sadiq didn't move. He stayed where he was watching. Zuwaira didn't force it. She focused on the ones who came. "Sit," she said quietly. They lowered themselves onto the floor, forming a loose circle around Hassan, whose cries had become hoarse and uneven. Zuwaira finally reached out gently, pulling him into her arms. He resisted at first, his body stiff, his breathing erratic. But she didn't tighten her hold. She didn't force comfort. She simply held him. Steady. "I'm here," she repeated softly. Hassan's hands clutched at her clothes. His crying didn't stop, but it changed. Less frantic, more human, more reachable. Zuwaira closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then she began to sing. It was soft, barely louder than a whisper. A Hausa lullaby, one her mother used to sing when nights felt too long and fears felt too big. The melody was simple, gentle, familiar in a way that didn't require understanding. The room didn't go silent immediately. Farouk shifted uncomfortably. Layla wiped her face, pretending she wasn't affected. Jamila watched her expression fragile. Sadiq stood still, his jaw tight. But the song continued. Steady, unbroken. And slowly, something began to change. Hassan's breathing eased, his grip softened, his crying faded into quiet sobs, then into silence. Zuwaira didn't stop singing. She kept going, because she knew this moment was not just for him, it was for all of them. Farouk leaned back slightly, his restless energy dissolving. Layla's shoulders dropped, her body relaxing in a way it hadn't in a long time. Jamila lowered her hands from her ears, her eyes filling with tears she didn't try to hide. And Sadiq? He took a step closer. Just one. But it mattered. The song filled the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, like something reaching into places words could not touch. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt different in that space. Until finally, Hassan fell asleep. In her arms, his breathing slow, peaceful. Zuwaira didn't move. She continued the song softer now, gentler. One by one, the others followed. Layla leaned against her shoulder, her eyes closing. Farouk stretched out on the floor, his body finally still. Jamila curled up beside them, her breathing steady. Even Sadiq sat down. Not close, but not far either. His eyes remained open for a while, watching, thinking, feeling something he didn't have words for, and eventually, he closed them. Downstairs, Musa stood in front of the security screen. He had heard the noise, the shouting, the crash. He had expected the worst, expected another failure, another ending. But what he saw instead, he couldn't explain. The room on the screen was no longer chaos. It was quiet. 5 children, his children, sleeping. Together. Calm. Still. And in the center of it all, Zuwaira Abdullahi. Holding them. Protecting that fragile peace. Musa leaned forward, his expression shifting in a way it hadn't in years. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Because if he did, he might break the moment. Something inside him stirred. Not just surprise, not just relief, but something deeper, something he had buried the day Amina died. Hope. Upstairs, Zuwaira slowly opened her eyes. The room was quiet now. Completely quiet. She looked down at the children resting around her, their faces different, softer, younger, like the weight they carried had lifted even if only for a moment. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, because she knew the truth. This was not the end. It was the beginning. Healing was not one night, not one song. It was a journey, a long one. But tonight, something had shifted, something real. And for the first time since she entered that house, Zuwaira allowed herself to believe they could be reached, all of them, even Sadiq, even Musa, because sometimes the loudest pain in a home is only waiting for someone who knows how to listen. Morning did not explode the way it usually did. There were no crashing plates, no screaming that echoed through the hallways, no doors slamming hard enough to shake the walls. Instead, the house woke slowly, almost cautiously, as if it were afraid to disturb something fragile that had formed during the night. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, stretching across the marble floors. The air felt lighter. Not peaceful, not yet, but different enough to be noticed. Zuwaira was the first to wake. She had barely moved through the night, sitting against the wall of Hassan's room, her back aching, but her arms still loosely wrapped around the small boy who had fallen asleep against her. Around her, the other children lay scattered, Farouk on the floor, Layla leaning sideways against a cushion, Jamila curled into herself, and Sadiq seated near the door. She took a slow breath before gently shifting. Carefully, so carefully. She eased Hassan onto the mattress. He stirred slightly, but did not wake. Zuwaira stood slowly, her muscles stiff, her body tired, but her eyes calm. She looked at each child one by one. For the first time, they did not look like a storm. They looked like children. Just children. She quietly stepped out of the room, closing the door halfway behind her. In the hallway, she paused. Not to rest, but to think. Last night had not fixed everything. She knew that, but it had opened something. A door that had been locked for too long, and now she had to be careful not to close it. Downstairs, the kitchen staff were already awake, moving through their routines with the usual efficiency. But as Zuwaira entered, their eyes turned toward her almost immediately. "You're still here," one of them said, unable to hide her surprise. Zuwaira nodded. "Yes." Another worker leaned closer. "We heard the noise last night. We thought—" She hesitated. "We thought it ended like the others." Zuwaira didn't respond to that directly. "Breakfast?" she asked instead. They exchanged glances. "You still want to serve them?" Zuwaira gave a small, calm nod. "Yes." There was something in her tone that made them stop questioning. Not authority, not pride, but quiet certainty. Upstairs, the children began to wake one by one. Farouk was first. He sat up quickly, looking around as if expecting something to explode. But nothing did. The room was quiet. Too quiet. "Layla," he whispered, nudging his sister. She groaned and opened her eyes. "What? Why is it so quiet?" Layla frowned, then sat up. Jamila stirred next, blinking slowly as if unsure where she was. Her gaze moved across the room and stopped. At Zuwaira's absence. Her expression shifted just slightly. Not fear, but something close to it. Then Hassan woke. He looked around quickly, his small face searching. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. No one answered. Sadiq stood last. He had already been awake, watching, thinking. He didn't speak, but he moved toward the door, opening it slowly. The hallway was empty. Something inside him tightened. He didn't understand why. "She left," Farouk said suddenly. Layla crossed her arms. "Of course she did." Jamila lowered her gaze. Hassan's face fell. "She said she wouldn't," he whispered. Sadiq said nothing. But for a moment, something flickered across his face. Disappointment. He turned away quickly. "Get ready," he said. "We're going downstairs." His voice was steady, but not as cold as before. They moved together slower than usual, uncertain. When they reached the dining hall, they stopped. Zuwaira was there, setting the table. Calm, present, like she had never left. Hassan ran forward first. "You're here," he said, his voice filled with relief. Zuwaira turned a soft smile, touching her lips. "I said I would be," she replied. He didn't hesitate. He hugged her, tightly. Zuwaira gently returned the embrace, careful not to overwhelm him. Behind them, the others stood still, watching. Farouk shifted awkwardly. Layla looked away. Jamila stepped forward slightly, then stopped. And Sadiq Hay stayed near the entrance, observing everything with quiet intensity. Zuwaira released Hassan and turned toward the others. "Breakfast is ready," she said gently. No one moved immediately. Then slowly, they took their seats. Not because they were told to, but because something inside the moment felt different. Zuwaira served the food without speaking much. She didn't rush them, didn't watch them too closely. She simply created space. Hassan ate first, carefully. Then Jamila. Farouk and Layla followed, though they tried to pretend it didn't matter. Sadiq was last. He picked up his spoon, then paused. His eyes moved toward Zuwaira. "Why are you still here?" he asked. The question was quiet, but heavy. Zuwaira met his gaze. "Because you didn't ask me to leave," she said. He frowned slightly. "I told you before." She shook her head gently. "You said I wouldn't last," she replied. "That's different." Silence. Sadiq looked down at his plate. For once, he didn't have an answer. Later that morning, Musa stood in his office replaying the footage from the night before. Again, and again. Each time he noticed something new. The way Zuwaira didn't panic. The way she gathered the children without force. The way they responded not immediately, but gradually. And the song. That simple, quiet song. He paused the screen on one image. All 5 children. Asleep. Together. He leaned back slowly. His chest felt tight, because he remembered something. Amina used to sing like that. Soft, steady, present. He hadn't realized how much the children missed it, how much he missed it. A knock came at the door. He didn't answer immediately. "Sir," the voice called again. "Come in," he said finally. A staff member stepped inside. "The children are having breakfast," she said. "Together." Musa nodded once. "I know." The woman hesitated. "There's been no incident this morning." He looked at her briefly, then nodded again. "You may go." When she left, the room fell silent. Musa stood and walked toward the window. For years he had tried to fix everything with control, with structure, with distance, but none of it had worked. And now, a stranger had done something he couldn't. Not by force, not by authority, but by staying. He exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time in a long time, Musa Danjuma left his office during the morning. He walked toward the dining hall, toward his children, and toward the woman who had changed something in his home, without asking for anything in return. When Musa Danjuma stepped into the dining hall that morning, no one noticed him at first. That alone was unusual. There had been a time when his presence commanded immediate silence, when even the smallest movement would stop the children mid-action. But now, as he stood near the entrance, he saw something he had not seen in a very long time. His children were sitting, eating, not perfectly, not peacefully, but together. Hassan sat closest to Zuwaira, holding his spoon carefully, occasionally glancing up at her, as if needing reassurance that she was still there. Jamila ate slowly, her movements quiet, thoughtful. Farouk and Layla still nudged each other from time to time, whispering under their breath, but they weren't throwing anything. They weren't shouting. And Sadiq? He sat upright, silent, his gaze occasionally lifting not toward Musa, but toward Zuwaira. Musa remained where he was for a moment longer, watching, trying to understand what had changed, or perhaps who had changed it. Zuwaira noticed him first. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the doorway, then returned to the table. She didn't stand, didn't interrupt the moment. She simply acknowledged his presence with a small nod, respectful, but not submissive. It caught Musa off guard. Most staff reacted differently. They stood immediately. They waited for instruction. They adjusted themselves around him. But she didn't. She stayed where she was, present with the children. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he didn't mind. He walked forward slowly and took a seat at the far end of the table. The children noticed him then. Hassan froze first, his spoon hovering mid-air. Jamila lowered her gaze. Farouk and Layla straightened slightly. Sadiq didn't move. But the room changed. The air shifted, tightened. Zuwaira noticed it immediately. The fragile calm from earlier began to pull inward, like something preparing to disappear. She placed a glass of water gently near Hassan. "Finish your food," she said softly, not as a command, but as reassurance. Hassan nodded and continued eating, though more carefully now. Musa observed everything, the small gestures, the subtle tension, the way the children responded not to him but to her. He leaned back slightly. "How was the night?" he asked. The question was directed at no one in particular, but it carried weight. Silence followed. The children avoided his gaze, until Zuwaira answered. "There was a difficult moment," she said calmly, "but they managed it." Musa's eyes shifted to her. "They," he repeated. She nodded. "Yes." He studied her for a moment. "You mean you managed it?" Zuwaira shook her head gently. "No," she said. "They did." The answer lingered in the air. Musa didn't respond immediately, because something about it unsettled him. Not the words themselves, but what they implied. That his children were not just problems to be controlled, but people capable of change. He turned his attention back to the table. "Eat," he said. The word was softer than usual, and for once, no one resisted. After breakfast, the children began to drift toward the playroom, not in chaos, not in perfect order either, but with less tension than before. Zuwaira followed them, not leading but not distant. She stayed close enough to be present, far enough to give them space. Inside the playroom, she didn't immediately direct them. She sat on the floor, waited, watched. Farouk picked up a toy, hesitated, then placed it back instead of throwing it. Layla walked in circles before eventually sitting down. Jamila moved toward the window, her usual place, but this time she didn't turn away completely. Hassan stayed close to Zuwaira. And Sadiq? He stood at the doorway again, watching, measuring, still deciding. Zuwaira spoke after a while. What did you like before she asked gently? No one answered. She didn't repeat the question. Instead, she picked up a small wooden puzzle from the shelf and began assembling it quietly, piece by piece, not asking for help, not explaining, just doing it. Minutes passed. Then Hassan leaned closer. What is that? He asked softly. A house, she replied. He watched, then reached out, placing a piece incorrectly. Zuwaira didn't correct him immediately. She let him try. When he struggled, she guided his hand gently. Turn it, she said. He did. It fit. His eyes lit up slightly. It worked, he whispered. Zuwaira smiled. Yes, that small moment didn't go unnoticed. Farouk glanced over, then Layla. Jamila shifted slightly, her attention drawn despite herself. Even Sadiq took a step inside. Slowly, the distance between them began to close, not through force, but through something simpler. Participation. Later that afternoon, Musa watched again from his office. But this time, something was different. He wasn't looking for failure. He was looking for understanding. The screen showed the playroom. The children were there. Zuwaira was there. But the chaos wasn't. Not completely gone, but quieter, contained, human. He leaned forward slightly, then paused the footage. Zoomed in, Hassan smiling, Farouk sitting still, Layla not shouting, Jamila watching instead of withdrawing, and Sadiq not leaving. Musa sat back. His chest tightened again, because he realized something. This wasn't control. This wasn't discipline. This was something he had forgotten how to give. Presence. Downstairs, Zuwaira stepped out briefly to get water. In the hallway, she paused. Not because she was tired, but because she felt it. The shift. The house was changing, slowly, delicately, but truly. She leaned lightly against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes, then opened them again, because she knew something else. Change does not come without resistance, and just as things begin to improve, something often tries to break it. Back in the playroom, Sadiq stood alone for a moment while the others were distracted. He looked around, at the room, at his siblings, at the quiet, then toward the door where Zuwaira had left. His jaw tightened slightly, because he didn't trust it, didn't trust the calm, didn't trust the feeling growing inside him. Hope. He had buried that long ago, when their mother died, when everything changed, when no one could fix it. He clenched his fists. This won't last, he whispered to himself. But his voice lacked certainty. And somewhere deep inside, a question he didn't want to ask began to form. What if... It does. At that same moment, Musa stood up again. He didn't return to his desk, didn't pick up his phone. Instead, he walked out of his office, toward the playroom, toward the children, toward Zuwaira Abdullahi. Because for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man who had already lost everything. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something fragile, something real. And he didn't want to turn away from it. Not this time. The rain came softly over Abuja that afternoon, tapping against the tall windows like a memory that refused to be ignored. Inside the mansion, the light dimmed into a calm gray, wrapping the house in a quieter mood. It was the kind of weather that pulled things to the surface. Zuwaira noticed it immediately. Not the rain itself, but the way it changed the children. Hassan stayed closer than usual, his small fingers gripping the edge of her scarf whenever thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Farouk and Layla argued less, but their energy turned inward, restless instead of explosive. Jamila moved slowly, her eyes drifting often toward the window. And Sadiq? He became more silent than ever. Silence, Zuwaira knew, was not always peace. Sometimes it was where the deepest pain lived. She sat on the floor of the playroom, watching them without interruption. The toys remained untouched for a while. Even Hassan didn't reach for them. The rain grew steadier. Then Jamila spoke. It was so quiet at first that Zuwaira almost thought she imagined it. Does it always rain like this here? The question was simple, but it wasn't about the weather. Zuwaira turned slightly toward her. Sometimes, she said gently. Jamila nodded. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. It rained like this the day she died. The room froze. Even the rain seemed to fade for a moment. Zuwaira didn't move. She didn't interrupt. She allowed the words to exist. Jamila's voice trembled slightly as she continued. The sky looked like this, she said. And the house? It was quiet like this, too. Hassan's grip on Zuwaira's scarf tightened. Farouk and Layla stopped moving completely. And Sadiq, he closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to push the memory away. But it was already there. Zuwaira spoke softly. Do you want to tell me about her? Jamila shook her head at first, then stopped. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She used to sing, she whispered. The words hit the room like something fragile breaking open. Zuwaira felt it, the connection, the reason the song had reached them that night. Jamila looked at her. Like you did. There was no accusation in her voice, only truth. Zuwaira's chest tightened slightly. What was her name? She asked gently. Amina Hassan answered before anyone else could. His voice was small, but certain. Zuwaira nodded. Amina, she repeated softly. The name settled into the room. Real, present, not something to be avoided. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Farouk shifted. She used to sit right there, he said, pointing toward a corner of the room. Layla nodded quickly. And she would make us sit, even when we didn't want to. Jamila let out a quiet breath. She never shouted. Sadiq's jaw tightened. She didn't need to, he said. It was the first time he had spoken. All eyes turned to him. He didn't look at them. He stared straight ahead. She just knew. He continued quietly. The words carried more weight than anything he had said before. Zuwaira understood. Amina had not controlled them. She had connected with them. And when she was gone, that connection had disappeared, leaving behind confusion, anger, fear, and a silence no one knew how to fill. Zuwaira shifted slightly, adjusting her position. You miss her, she said. It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. Jamila nodded immediately. Hassan buried his face against Zuwaira's side. Farouk and Layla looked down. And Sadiq? He didn't respond, but he didn't deny it either. Zuwaira continued gently. Missing someone doesn't go away, she said. It doesn't become smaller just because time passes. The children listened, because no one had said this to them before. Sometimes, she added, it just changes shape. Jamila looked at her. What do you mean, Zuwaira thought for a moment. It becomes something you carry, she said, not something that controls you. The idea lingered, unfamiliar, but possible. Hassan lifted his head slightly. Will she come back? He asked. The question hung in the air like something too heavy for a child to hold. Zuwaira felt it deeply, but she didn't look away. No, she said softly. The truth. Gentle. Unavoidable. Hassan's eyes filled with tears again. Zuwaira placed a hand lightly on his back. But the love she gave you. She continued, that stays. He didn't respond immediately, but his crying didn't return either. Jamila wiped her eyes slowly. I don't want to forget her, she said. You won't, Zuwaira replied. Sadiq finally looked at her. How do you know? There was challenge in his voice. but also something else. Need. Zuwaira met his gaze. "Because you remember her now," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked away again. But this time, he didn't shut down. The room remained quiet. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with something new. Shared memory. Shared truth. Zuwaira stood slowly. "Come," she said gently. No one asked why. They followed. Even Sadiq. She led them to a part of the house they rarely visited, a small sitting room near the back, where a piano stood untouched, covered lightly in dust. Jamila's eyes widened slightly. "I remember this," she whispered. Zuwaira uncovered the piano slowly. "Did she play?" she asked. Jamila nodded. "A little." Zuwaira sat down. "I don't know how to play well," she said honestly. Then she pressed a few keys. Soft, simple. The notes filled the room gently. Not perfect, but real. Then she began to sing again. The same lullaby. But this time, the children were awake, listening, understanding. Hassan moved closer first, then Jamila. Farouk and Layla sat quietly behind them. And Sadiq, he remained standing. But he didn't leave. The song wasn't about sleep this time. It wasn't about calming chaos. It was about something else. Remembering, connecting, healing. Zuwaira didn't try to replace Amina. She didn't try to take her place. She simply created space for her to exist again, in memory, in feeling, in truth. When the song ended, no one spoke. They didn't need to, because something had changed. Not completely, not permanently, but deeply enough to matter. Later that evening, Musa stood alone in his office again. But he wasn't watching the cameras this time. He didn't need to. He had heard the piano, he had heard the song, and something inside him had broken open. He sat down slowly, his hands resting on the desk. Because for years he had avoided this, avoided the memory of Amina, avoided the pain his children carried, believing distance would protect them. But it hadn't. It had only left them alone with it. And now, a stranger had walked into his home and given them something he had not. Permission to feel, permission to remember, permission to heal. Musa closed his eyes briefly, then stood. Because for the first time in a long time, he knew what he needed to do, and it was not business, it was not control, it was not distance, it was something much harder. He needed to be present, not as a CEO, but as a father, and somehow, Zuwaira Abdullahi had shown him how. The shift inside Musa Danjuma's mansion did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly like light entering a room through a window that had been closed for too long. Days passed, then a week, and slowly patterns began to change. The children still argued. Farouk and Layla still pushed boundaries. Hassan still woke at night, sometimes reaching out in fear. Jamila still retreated into silence when emotions felt too heavy. And Sadiq. He still watched everything from a distance. But something was different. They were no longer alone inside their pain. Zuwaira moved through their days like a steady presence, never forcing, never demanding, but always there. She didn't try to control their behavior the way others had. She didn't raise her voice to overpower them. Instead, she listened. She noticed. And she stayed. That consistency began to build something fragile but real. Trust. It showed itself in small moments. Hassan no longer cried himself to sleep every night. Sometimes he would sit beside Zuwaira, holding her hand quietly until his breathing settled. Jamila began speaking more, not much, but enough to let pieces of her inner world surface. Farouk and Layla still acted out, but their chaos had softened. They argued, but they also laughed again. Even Sadiq had changed. Not openly, not obviously, But he no longer walked away every time Zuwaira entered a room, and he listened, even when he pretended not to. One evening, after the children had gone to their rooms, Zuwaira stepped out into the quiet hallway. The house felt different at night now, not silent in the way it used to be, but calmer, as if it had learned how to breathe again. She walked toward the kitchen to get water. But she wasn't alone. Musa stood near the window at the end of the corridor, his back turned, his posture still and thoughtful. For a moment, Zuwaira hesitated. She had rarely spoken to him directly since arriving. Their interactions had been brief, practical. He remained distant, not cold, but guarded. She could walk away, but something told her not to. "Sir," she said softly. Musa turned. His eyes met hers, steady, searching. "Zuwaira," he replied. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but uncertain. "How are the children?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried more meaning than before. "They are trying," she said. Musa studied her face, as if weighing the words. "And you?" he asked. The question caught her slightly off guard. "I am here," she replied. A faint shift crossed his expression. Not quite a smile, but something close. "I've noticed," he said quietly. Silence returned, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt open. Musa stepped closer, just enough to reduce the distance between them, but not enough to overwhelm it. "I watched the footage," he said. Zuwaira didn't react. "I saw what happened that night." She nodded slightly. "They needed someone," she said. Musa's gaze lowered briefly. "They needed their father," he replied. The honesty in his voice surprised even him. Zuwaira didn't rush to respond. She allowed the truth to settle. "They still do," she said gently. Musa exhaled slowly. I don't know how he admitted. The words were quiet, but heavy. Zuwaira looked at him. "You don't have to know everything," she said. "You just have to be there." He met her gaze again. "That sounds simple." "It isn't," she replied. Something in her tone made him pause. She wasn't speaking lightly. She understood what she was saying, and yet she added softly, "It's the only thing that works." Musa turned slightly, looking out the window again. The city lights stretched into the distance, steady and controlled everything his life had always been. Except here. Here he had lost control, lost direction, lost connection. "I thought providing for them was enough," he said after a moment. Zuwaira stepped closer, her voice calm. "It helped," she said, "but it didn't replace what they lost." He nodded slowly. "I see that now." Another pause. Then Musa spoke again. "They trust you." Zuwaira didn't answer immediately. "They are learning to trust again," she said. He looked at her. "And you?" She held his gaze. "I don't expect anything from them," she said. "That makes it easier." Musa considered that. Expectation, control, outcome. Those were the things he understood. But she was operating differently. Without pressure, without demand. And somehow, it was working. "You've done more in a few days than anyone else in years," he said. Zuwaira shook her head gently. "They were ready?" she replied. He frowned slightly. "Ready?" She nodded. They just needed someone who didn't leave. The words settled deeply, because they were not just about the children. They were about him. Musa looked away again. His jaw tightened slightly. For years he had stayed physically present, but emotionally distant, believing it was enough. But now, he wasn't so sure. Zuwaira stepped back slightly, giving him space again. "I should check on them," she said. He nodded, but before she could leave Zuwaira, she turned. Yes, Musa hesitated for a brief moment, then asked, "Why did you stay?" It was a question he hadn't asked anyone before, because no one had given him a reason to. Zuwaira thought for a moment, then answered simply, "Because I understood them." He watched her closely, and most people didn't. She shook her head. They saw behavior, she said. I saw pain. The difference was clear and undeniable. Musa lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back at her. Thank you, he said. The words felt unfamiliar on his tongue, but they were real. Zuwaira gave a small nod, then turned and walked back toward the children's rooms, leaving Musa alone in the hallway, but not in the same way as before, because something had changed, not just in the house, but in him. That night, Musa didn't return to his office. He walked toward the children's wing, slowly, uncertainly. When he reached the hallway, he paused outside Hassan's room. The door was slightly open. Inside, Zuwaira sat beside the bed, humming softly as Hassan drifted to sleep. Jamila sat nearby, quiet. Farouk and Layla lay on the floor, whispering softly. And Sadiq. He sat against the wall, watching, present. Musa stood there for a long moment. Then, for the first time in years, he stepped inside. No one spoke. No one reacted dramatically. But they felt it. His presence. Different this time. Not distant, not controlling, just there. Zuwaira looked up briefly. Their eyes met. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to, because this moment did not belong to her. It belonged to him and his children. Musa moved slowly toward the bed, then stopped, unsure of what to do next. But he didn't leave, and that alone was a beginning. Change rarely arrives alone. When something begins to heal, something else often rises to resist it. In Musa Danjuma's world, peace was not just fragile, it was visible. And anything visible in a house of wealth and influence eventually attracted attention. The first sign came quietly. A phone call. Musa stood in his office listening as his assistant spoke. Sir Hadiza Bello has returned to Abuja, the voice said. She requested a meeting. Musa didn't respond immediately. He already knew what that meant. Hadiza Bello was not just another name in his circle. She was known, respected in high society, admired for her beauty, her elegance, and her strategic mind. She came from a powerful family, one that understood wealth, influence, and the unspoken rules of status. And for a long time, she had been interested in him, not subtly, not casually, directly. Musa had never accepted her advances, not after Amina, not when his life was still wrapped in grief and distance. But Hadiza was patient, and she did not like losing. I'll see her, Musa said finally. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. Zuwaira knew nothing about it, but she felt something shift that day. Not in the children, in the air. The house staff moved differently, quieter, more alert. Small details changed. The living room was prepared more carefully. Fresh flowers appeared where there had been none. Something was coming, and though she didn't know what, Zuwaira paid attention. That afternoon, Hadiza Bello arrived exactly on time. She stepped out of a sleek black car, her presence commanding without effort. Her dress was elegant, her posture confident, her expression controlled but warm when needed. She didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She entered like someone who already belonged. The staff greeted her with quiet respect. "Welcome back, madam." She smiled slightly. "It's good to be back." Inside, Musa waited in the main sitting room. Their eyes met. "Musa," she said, her voice smooth. "Hadiza?" They didn't embrace, but the familiarity between them was clear. "It's been a while," she added. "Taking a seat without invitation, yes," he replied. She studied him carefully. "You look different." Musa didn't ask what she meant. "Life has been busy." Hadiza smiled faintly. "It always is for men like you." There was a pause. Then she leaned slightly forward. "I heard things have changed in your home." Musa's expression remained neutral. "People talk," she added lightly. "They always do." Her eyes moved around the room briefly. 5 children, she said. Still as difficult as ever, Musa didn't answer immediately. "They are improving," he said finally. Hadiza's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Improving," she repeated. "That's unexpected." There was curiosity in her voice, but also something sharper. "Who managed that?" she asked. Musa hesitated for the briefest moment, then said, "Their caregiver." Hadiza leaned back slightly. "A new one, yes." She tilted her head. "And this one succeeded. Where 99 others failed, the question wasn't disbelief, it was calculation." Musa didn't respond, but his silence confirmed enough. Hadiza smiled again. "I would like to meet her." The request was casual, but deliberate. Musa's gaze sharpened slightly. "Why?" She shrugged lightly. "I'm curious." He studied her for a moment, then stood. "I'll call her." Upstairs, Zuwaira was in the playroom with the children when a staff member approached. "Madam," the woman said quietly, "Sir is asking for you." Zuwaira nodded. "I'll be back," she told the children. Hassan looked at her immediately. "Where are you going?" "Just downstairs," she said gently. "I won't be long." He hesitated, then nodded. Sadiq watched her leave without speaking. When Zuwaira entered the sitting room, she stopped just inside the doorway. Hadiza Bello was there, and instantly, the difference between their worlds was clear. Hadiza's eyes moved over her slowly, measuring, judging. Zuwaira remained calm, present. Musa Hadiza said softly, "This is her." "Yes," he replied. Zuwaira stepped forward slightly. "Good afternoon," she said respectfully. Hadiza didn't return the greeting immediately. She stood, walked closer. "You're the one who stayed," she said. It wasn't a compliment. Zuwaira didn't respond. Hadiza circled slightly, her gaze sharp. "What is your name?" "Zuwaira Abdullahi." A brief pause. Then Hadiza smiled, this time openly condescending. "A maid from Kano," she said lightly. The words carried weight, class, difference, distance. Zuwaira met her gaze. Yes. No apology. No shame. Just truth. Hadiza's expression shifted slightly. She wasn't used to that. "You must be very patient," she added. Zuwaira didn't respond. Musa stepped in. "That'll be all, Zuwaira." She nodded, then left. But as she walked away, she felt it, the shift, the tension. Something had entered the house, something that did not belong to the children's healing, something that threatened it. Back in the sitting room, Hadiza sat down again. "She's calm," she said. "Yes, she doesn't speak much." "No." Hadiza smiled faintly. "That won't last." Musa's gaze hardened. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward slightly. "Musa, you know how this works," she said. "People like her. They don't stay in places like this." He didn't respond. "They don't understand boundaries," she continued. "They become comfortable." The implication was clear, dangerous. Musa's voice dropped slightly. "She has done more for my children than anyone else." Hadiza tilted her head. "Exactly," she said. Silence heavy. Then she added quietly, "And that is precisely why you should be careful." The words settled into the room like something intentional, planted, calculated. Musa didn't answer, but something had been introduced. Doubt. Upstairs, Zuwaira returned to the playroom. Hassan ran to her immediately. "You came back," he said. She smiled gently. "I told you I would." But her eyes moved toward Sadiq. He was watching her closely. "You're different," he said suddenly. The room stilled. Zuwaira paused. "How?" she asked. Sadiq didn't look away. "Something happened," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer directly, but he didn't press further, because he already felt it. Something had changed. And it wasn't good. That night, as the house settled again, Hadiza remained. Not as a guest. but as someone who intended to stay. And quietly, without raising her voice, without creating chaos, she began to observe, to plan, to wait, because unlike the children, she didn't react emotionally. She acted strategically. And in her mind, Zuwaira Abdullahi was not a helper. She was an obstacle, one that needed to be removed. The mansion did not change overnight when Hadiza Bello decided to stay. It shifted quietly, almost invisibly. But for someone like Zuwaira, it was impossible not to feel. The warmth that had slowly begun to return to the house did not disappear. The children still gathered around her. Hassan still reached for her hand. Jamila still lingered close when emotions felt heavy. Farouk and Layla still tested boundaries, but with less chaos than before. Even Sadiq remained watchful, but present. And yet there was something else now, something colder, something observing. Hadiza moved through the house with elegance and control. She never raised her voice, never openly challenged Zuwaira. She smiled when spoken to, greeted the children with polished kindness, and carried herself as though she already belonged. But beneath it all, she was watching, learning, waiting. Zuwaira noticed the patterns first. Small things. The way certain staff members suddenly became distant. Conversation stopped when she entered the room. Tasks she usually handled were quietly reassigned, then returned as if someone were testing her place. Then came the questions. Not direct accusations, just carefully placed words. Did you move this? Was this always here? Who had access to this room? Each question carried an implication without stating it. Zuwaira answered calmly, but she understood. This was not curiosity. This was preparation. One afternoon, while the children rested after lunch, Zuwaira stepped into the hallway to get water. That was when she heard it. Hadiza's voice. Low, controlled. Speaking to one of the house staff. "You must pay attention," Hadiza said. "People who arrive suddenly sometimes forget their place." The staff member hesitated. "But madam, she has been," Hadiza cut her off. "That is not the point." Silence followed. Then Hadiza added softly, "Trust is not given easily in a house like this, especially not to someone from outside." Zuwaira didn't step forward. She didn't interrupt. She simply turned away quietly and returned to the children, but something inside her settled. Not fear, understanding. This was no longer just about care. It was about position, power, and perception. That evening, the moment came. It began in the main sitting room. Hadiza sat calmly, a small jewelry box resting on the table beside her. Musa stood nearby reviewing something on his phone. The staff moved quietly in the background. Zuwaira had just come downstairs with Hassan when Hadiza spoke. "Musa," she said lightly. "Something is missing." Musa looked up. "What do you mean?" Hadiza opened the box. Inside, it was empty. "My bracelet," she said. "It was here this morning." The room stilled. Zuwaira stopped walking. Hassan looked up at her, confused. Hadiza didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse directly. But her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, toward Zuwaira. "I'm sure it will turn up," Musa said calmly. Hadiza smiled faintly. "Of course," she replied, "but it's a valuable piece. It doesn't just disappear." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, because they understood what was happening. Zuwaira stepped forward. "I have not seen it," she said quietly. Hadiza tilted her head. "I didn't say you had." The words were smooth, but sharp. Musa's gaze moved between them. Something in his expression shifted. Not certainty, but hesitation. And that was enough. Hadiza stood slowly. "I think it's best we check," she said, "just to be sure." No one objected, because no one felt they could. The search began. Rooms were checked one by one, drawers opened, shelves examined, and then Zuwaira's room. She stood at the doorway as Hadiza stepped inside. The space was simple, organized, clean. Hadiza moved slowly, carefully, then stopped. Her hand reached toward the small bag Zuwaira had brought from Kano. She opened it, paused, and then she lifted something into the light. A bracelet. The room went silent. Hassan's grip tightened on Zuwaira's hand. Zuwaira didn't move, didn't react, but her eyes fixed on the object, because she knew. She had never seen it before. Hadiza turned. "There it is," she said softly. No anger, no shouting, just quiet confirmation. Musa stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Zuwaira," he said. Her name carried weight now. Zuwaira met his gaze. "I did not take it," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, but the room did not feel steady anymore. Hadiza spoke gently. "No one is accusing you," she said, "but it was found here." Zuwaira didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Musa. "Sir," she said, "I did not take it." Musa hesitated, just for a moment, but that moment was everything, because for the first time, doubt entered his eyes, and Zuwaira saw it, felt it, understood it. The silence stretched, heavy, unforgiving. Then Musa spoke. "Until we understand what happened," he said slowly, "it's best you step away for now." The words were controlled, measured, but they cut deep. Hassan shook his head immediately. "No," he said. "She didn't do it." Jamila stepped forward. She wouldn't. Farouk and Layla looked uncertain but uneasy. And Sadiq, he stared at Musa, his jaw tight. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Musa didn't respond, because he didn't know. Didn't know what was true, didn't know who to believe, and that uncertainty cost him everything. Zuwaira lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in guilt, but in acceptance, because she understood something he didn't. Truth does not always win immediately. She looked back up. "I will leave," she said. Hassan's grip tightened. "No," he whispered. She knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "You will be okay?" she said. Tears filled his eyes. "Don't go." Her hand rested lightly on his head. "I will come back," she said softly. But this time, the promise felt different, because she didn't know if it was true. She stood, looked at each child. Jamila frozen in quiet pain, Farouk and Layla confused, Sadiq angry but silent. Then she turned and walked out. No shouting, no defense, no fight, just quiet dignity. Behind her, the house fell into silence again, but not the same silence as before. This one was heavier, broken. And upstairs, as the door closed behind her, Hassan began to cry, not loudly, not violently, but deeply, because something important had just been taken from them. And this time, it wasn't chaos. It was hope. The silence that followed Zuwaira's departure was not the same as before she arrived. This silence had weight. It pressed against the walls, settled into the corners, and lingered in every room like something that refused to be ignored. The house had not returned to chaos immediately, but something essential was missing. And the children felt it first. That night, Hassan did not sleep. He lay on his bed, staring at the door, waiting, listening, as if at any moment Zuwaira would return, sit beside him, and hum softly until his breathing slowed. But no one came. His small hands clutched the edge of the blanket, his eyes filling with tears he tried not to let fall. In the next room, Jamila sat by the window, unmoving. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her silence had returned, the same deep, distant silence she had carried after their mother died. Farouk and Layla argued briefly, but it didn't last. Without Zuwaira to absorb their energy, their voices faded quickly into nothing. And Sadiq. He didn't go to his room. He sat in the hallway, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, waiting, thinking, his eyes fixed on the stairs, as if daring someone to come up and explain what had just happened. But no one did. Downstairs, Musa stood alone in his office. The bracelet lay on his desk, small, innocent, and yet it had changed everything. He stared at it for a long time, replaying the moment again and again. Zuwaira's voice. I did not take it, the way she said it, calm, certain, without fear, without desperation. And then his own response, his hesitation, the doubt in his eyes. He exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face. Something didn't feel right. It hadn't felt right from the beginning, but he had ignored it. Why? Because the evidence was clear. Or because someone had made it seem clear. Musa leaned back in his chair, his mind shifted, reanalyzing, reconstructing. Because this was not business. This was not a decision he could make with logic alone. This was something else, something personal. And for the first time in years, he felt uncertain. A knock came at the door. He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Sir," Sadiq's voice. Musa looked up. "Come in." The door opened slowly. Sadiq stepped inside. His expression was controlled, but his eyes held something sharper. Anger. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. "You made a mistake," he said. No greeting, no hesitation. Musa straightened slightly. "Careful how you speak to me." But his voice lacked its usual authority. Sadiq didn't back down. She didn't take it. The words were direct, certain. Musa watched him. "How do you know?" Sadiq stepped closer. "Because she doesn't lie." The answer came without pause. Musa's jaw tightened. "You've known her for a few days." "That's enough," Sadiq replied. Silence filled the room. Then Sadiq added quietly, "You didn't even try to believe her." The words landed heavily, because they were true. Musa didn't respond immediately. Sadiq turned slightly, his voice lowering. "She stayed when everyone else left," he said. "She didn't shout. She didn't hurt us. She didn't give up." He looked back at his father. "And you let her go." Musa felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not defense, something deeper. Regret. Sadiq exhaled sharply. "She was the only one who understood us," he said. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Musa remained still. Because there was nothing he could say to undo what had been done. Upstairs, the night stretched long. Hassan's quiet crying eventually faded into exhaustion. Jamila didn't move from the window. Farouk and Layla slept restlessly, and Sadiq returned to the hallway. Still waiting. Still thinking. Because something didn't make sense, and he couldn't ignore it. The next morning the house changed again, but this time, not for the better. The chaos returned, not immediately, but steadily. Hassan refused to eat. Jamila didn't speak at all. Farouk threw a cup across the room. Layla shouted at the staff, and Sadiq, he didn't stop them, he didn't try. Because something inside him had shut down again. The fragile progress they had made was breaking. And Musa saw it. From the dining table, from the hallway, from the silence that followed each outburst. He saw it. And this time, he couldn't look away. Hadiza watched as well, calm, composed, unbothered, as if everything was unfolding exactly as expected. She stepped into the dining room that morning, her presence controlled. "Children," she said lightly, "you should behave." No one listened. Farouk pushed his plate away. Layla rolled her eyes. Jamila didn't respond. Hassan looked down. And Sadiq didn't even acknowledge her. Hadiza's smile faded slightly. just for a moment, then returned. Polished, unshaken. But inside, she noticed. This was not working the way she intended. Zuwaira's absence had not restored order. It had removed something essential, something she hadn't accounted for. Musa stood at the doorway watching everything. The noise, the distance, the collapse. And suddenly, it became clear. This wasn't about the bracelet. It never was. He turned, walked back toward his office, closed the door, and picked up the phone. Review the footage, he said to his security team. From yesterday. Every camera. His voice was firm, focused. For the first time since the incident. Certain. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The footage was sent. Musa watched it himself, carefully, frame by frame. Until he saw it. Hadiza, alone, in the hallway, holding something small in her hand. The bracelet. Placing it into Zuwaira's bag. Deliberate, calm, planned. Musa froze. The truth hit him like something sharp, clear, undeniable. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, not just because of what she had done, but because of what he had allowed. He stood immediately, walked out of the office, straight into the sitting room. Hadiza was there, waiting, as if she already knew. "Musa," she said softly. He didn't respond. He walked to the table, placed the tablet down, played the footage. Silence filled the room. Hadiza's expression didn't change immediately. Then slowly. It did. "You planned this," Musa said. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. Hadiza exhaled softly. It was necessary. The words were calm, as if she believed them. Musa stared at her. "You framed her." "She didn't belong here," Hadiza replied. "You know that." Something inside Musa broke, not loudly, but completely. "She belonged more than anyone in this house," he said. Hadiza's smile faded. "You're choosing her over. I'm choosing what's right." He cut in. Silence. Heavy. Final. Musa stepped back. "You need to leave." Hadiza didn't move. "This is a mistake," No, Musa said quietly. "The mistake was trusting you. That was the end. No shouting, no argument. Just truth. And consequence." Hadiza stood slowly, her composure intact, but her eyes colder now. "This isn't over," she said. Musa didn't respond. Because for him, it was. As she walked out of the house, the silence returned again. But this time, it felt different, clearer, like something had been removed. But one thing remained, the most important thing. Zuwaira was gone. And now, Musa had to find her. Musa Danjuma did not wait until morning. The moment Hadiza's car disappeared beyond the gates, he turned back into the house with a clarity he had not felt in years. There was no hesitation left in him now, no confusion, no doubt. Only one thought remained. Find her. Upstairs, the children were still scattered across the rooms, carrying the weight of what had happened. Hassan sat on his bed, eyes swollen from crying. Jamila had not left her corner. Farouk and Layla moved restlessly, unsure where to place their energy, and Sadiq. He stood at the top of the stairs, watching his father. Musa looked up. For a brief moment their eyes met. "I made a mistake," Musa said. The words were simple, but they were real. Sadiq didn't respond immediately. "Are you going to fix it?" he asked finally. Musa nodded once. "Yes, that was enough." "Then don't wait," Sadiq said. Musa didn't. Within the hour, he was on the road. The night air of Abuja felt colder than usual, the city lights blurring past as his driver followed directions Musa had given without hesitation. Kano. That was where she had come from. That was where he would start. The journey felt longer than it had before, not because of the distance, but because of the weight he carried with him. Regret, guilt, and something deeper. understanding. For the first time, Musa was not moving as a CEO solving a problem. He was moving as a man trying to repair something he had broken. Back in Kano, life continued the way it always had. Unchanged. Unaware. Zuwaira had returned quietly. No announcement, no explanation. She stepped back into her small home, as if she had never left. Yusuf saw her first. "You're back," he said, surprised. Zuwaira nodded, setting her bag down. "Yes." He studied her face. "Did it not work?" There was no accusation in his voice, just concern. Zuwaira smiled faintly. "It worked," she said softly. He frowned. "Then why are you here?" She paused. Because the answer was not simple. Sometimes she said things break before they are understood. Yusuf didn't fully grasp the meaning, but he didn't press further. He hugged her, and she held him, tightly, because even though she had returned to the place she knew, something inside her had changed. That night, sleep did not come easily. Not for Musa, not for Zuwaira, and not for the children, because absence has a way of making truth louder. The next day, Musa arrived in Kano. The contrast struck him immediately. The streets were narrower, the air heavier. The life here simpler, but harder. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes touching the dusty ground, his presence immediately drawing attention. People watched, not just because of who he was, but because of how different he looked from everything around him. He didn't care. He asked for her, again and again, until finally he found the street, the house. Small, worn, real. Musa stood outside for a moment, because for the first time, he understood the distance between their worlds, not just in wealth, but in experience, in survival, in strength. Then he stepped forward and knocked. Inside, Zuwaira froze. She knew that knock, not the sound, the feeling. Yusuf looked at her. "Are you expecting someone?" She shook her head slowly, then walked to the door and opened it. Musa stood there. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be said was already in their eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. No introduction, no explanation, just truth. Zuwaira looked at him, calm, still. "You came a long way to say that," she replied. "Yes." Silence. Then Musa stepped forward slightly. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything." Zuwaira didn't respond immediately. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her, not to shut him out, but to protect the moment. "The bracelet," he continued, "it was not you. I know," she said. Her voice carried no bitterness, and that hurt more than anger would have. Musa exhaled slowly. "I saw the footage," he added. "I saw what she did." Zuwaira nodded, still calm, still composed. "You should have believed me," she said. The words were quiet, but they landed heavily. Musa lowered his gaze. "I should have," he admitted. Silence followed, the kind that holds truth without needing more words. Then he looked back at her. "They need you," he said. Zuwaira's expression shifted slightly, not visibly, but internally. "I know," she replied. "And I need you," he added. That was new, unexpected. Zuwaira studied him carefully, because this was not about words anymore. It was about trust. And trust does not return easily once it is broken. Why, she asked. The question was simple, but it mattered. Musa didn't rush his answer. "Because I don't know how to do this without you," he said honestly, "and I don't want to lose them again." The truth in his voice was clear, unpolished, real. Zuwaira looked away briefly, her thoughts moving, weighing, because she knew something he was only beginning to understand. This was not just about returning, it was about whether she could stay. Again. Yusuf opened the door slightly, peeking out. His eyes moved between them. "Who is this?" he asked. Zuwaira turned. "This is Musa," she said. Yusuf frowned slightly. The one with the difficult children. Musa almost smiled. Yes, he said. Yusuf looked at his sister. Are you going back? Zuwaira didn't answer immediately, because the answer was still forming. At that exact moment, a sound broke the stillness. Running footsteps, voices, familiar. Mama Zuwaira's heart stopped for a second. She turned. And there they were, all 5 of them, standing at the end of the street, breathing heavily, eyes wide. Hassan ran first, straight into her arms. You left, he cried. Zuwaira knelt, holding him tightly. I had to. Jamila followed, tears already falling. Farouk and Layla stood close behind, and Sadiq stopped a few steps away, but he didn't look away. We came to bring you back, he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes, they said everything. Zuwaira looked at them, all of them, together, not broken, not chaotic, but connected, because they had chosen to come, to fight for her. And in that moment, the decision became clear. She stood slowly, still holding Hassan's hand, then looked at Musa. I will come back, she said. A breath he didn't realize he was holding. Released. But not the same way she added. Musa nodded. He understood, or at least, he was ready to try, because this time, he would not make the same mistake. The journey back to Abuja felt different from the journey that had taken Zuwaira away. This time she was not alone. Hassan refused to leave her side, sitting close enough that his shoulder touched hers the entire drive. Jamila stayed quiet, but present her eyes no longer distant. Farouk and Layla argued softly over small things, but there was no sharpness in their voices. And Sadiq Hey sat near the window watching the road pass by, thoughtful, but no longer closed. Musa sat in the front, not as a distant figure, but as part of something he was still learning to understand. They didn't speak much during the drive. They didn't need to, because something had already been said, not through words, but through action, through choice, through return. When they arrived at the mansion, the gates opened slowly, as they always had. But this time the feeling was not the same. It no longer felt like a place filled with tension and distance. It felt uncertain, like something waiting to be rebuilt. Zuwaira stepped out of the car and paused. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood what this moment meant. Coming back was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one. The children ran ahead, familiar with the space, their energy returning, but softer, more grounded. Hassan turned back halfway and reached for her hand. Come, he said. Zuwaira smiled gently and followed. Inside the house, staff stood quietly watching, some surprised, some relieved, some uncertain, because they had seen what happened before, and they didn't know what would happen now. Zuwaira walked through the hallway, slowly taking in the space again. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Musa stopped near the center of the living room, then turned to face her. The children gathered instinctively around them. He didn't speak immediately, because this moment mattered, and for once, he did not want to rush it. I made a promise, Musa said finally. His voice was calm, clear, to do better. Zuwaira held his gaze. I remember, she replied. There was no softness in her tone, only truth. Musa nodded. And I will keep it, he said. The children looked between them. They didn't fully understand the words, but they felt the weight behind them. Zuwaira took a slow breath, then said, I will stay. Hassan smiled immediately. Jamila's shoulders relaxed. Farouk and Layla exchanged quick glances, and Sadiq, he didn't smile, but he nodded. Once, that was enough. Days passed, then weeks, and this time the change did not break. It held, not perfectly, not easily, but steadily. Musa began to show up, not just physically, but truly present. He joined meals, sat with the children even when the silence felt uncomfortable, listened even when he didn't know how to respond. Sometimes he made mistakes. Sometimes he said the wrong thing, but he didn't leave. And that mattered. Zuwaira remained the steady center, not replacing Amina, never trying to, but creating space for her memory to exist without pain. The children grew, not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly. Hassan slept through the night more often. Jamila began to smile, again small, quiet smiles that felt real. Farouk and Layla still argued, but now they also played. And Sadiq, he changed the most, not outwardly, but deeply. He began to speak more, not always, not easily. But when he did, it was honest. One evening, as the sun set over Abuja, the family gathered in the sitting room. The piano stood nearby, uncovered now. Zuwaira sat beside it, not playing, just resting her hands on the keys. The children were close. Musa stood a few steps away, watching, feeling something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Peace, real peace. Not silence, not control, but connection. Zuwaira looked up, then pressed a few keys. Soft notes filled the room. Hassan leaned against her. Jamila sat quietly beside him. Farouk and Layla settled nearby. And Sadiq, he moved closer, not at the edge anymore, but within the circle. Zuwaira began to sing, the same song, the one that had changed everything. But this time, it was not about calming chaos. It was not about stopping pain. It was about something else. Belonging. Musa stepped forward slowly, then stopped. Unsure, Zuwaira looked at him, just for a moment, and in that look, she invited him in. Without words, without pressure. Musa hesitated, then took the final step, and sat. Not as a guest, not as a distant figure, but as a father, as part of them. The song continued, and for the first time in years, the house did not feel empty. It felt full, alive, whole. Weeks later, Musa stood in the same living room, but this time something else filled the space. Guests, close friends, family. Not for business, not for status, but for something personal. A moment that mattered. Zuwaira stood beside him. Simple, elegant, true to herself. The children stood nearby, not perfectly still, not perfectly quiet, but happy. Musa looked at her, then spoke. I spent years trying to protect my family with everything I had, he said, but I forgot the one thing they needed most. He paused, then continued. Someone who would stay. Zuwaira met his gaze. And someone who would listen, she added. A soft murmur moved through the room. Musa nodded, then took a small step closer. Zuwaira Abdullahi, he said, his voice steady. Will you build this family with me? There was no grand display, no dramatic gesture, just truth and intention. Zuwaira looked at the children, at Hassan holding her hand, at Jamila watching with quiet hope, at Farouk and Layla smiling without hiding it, at Sadiq, who gave a small, certain nod. Then she looked back at Musa. Yes, she said, and just like that, the story that began with chaos ended with something stronger, not perfection, not fantasy, but a family, built through pain, held together by patience, and healed by someone who chose to stay when everyone else walked away. Sometimes the deepest wounds are not the ones we can see, but the ones we carry silently inside. Children don't always express pain in ways we understand. They don't always ask for help. Sometimes they push people away, not because they don't need love, but because they are afraid of losing it again. This story reminds us that healing doesn't come from control, wealth, or power. It comes from presence, from patience, from staying even when it's hard. Zuwaira didn't change that family because she was perfect. She changed them because she listened when others judged. She stayed when others left. She saw pain where others saw problems. And in doing so, she gave them something no one else could, a chance to heal. If this story touched your heart, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories that remind us what truly matters in life.